Hello, class. So today we're going to talk about chapter 23 and we're going to measure a nation's income. So we're going to look at how do we measure income of a nation. And the way we do it is through a process or through a measurement called gross domestic product or GDP. How is GDP related to a total income and spending? We're going to look into that. Whenever you hear the economy is growing, we mean that this number, GDP, is increasing. When we say the economy is in a recession, we mean this number is falling. So this is a very important number, and every 3 months, the US government calculates this number to see how the economy is doing. We're going to see what are the components of GDP, and we're going to see how is GDP corrected for inflation. Inflation is the rising prices that we see from one year to the next, and we're going to cover about inflation later. And we're going to see how GDP measures society's well-being. So gross domestic product basically measures the total income of every individual in a country. It also measures the total expenditure of every products, goods, or services produced within the borders of a country. So for the economy as a whole, the income equals expenditure, not for individuals. For some individuals, income might be more than expenditure, or for others, expenditures might be more than income. But for the whole economy, total income equals total expenditure, and every dollar that a buyer spends is basically a dollar of income for a seller. So a more formal definition of GDP is it's the market value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of a country in a given period of time. So market values means that goods are valued at their market prices, which means that goods are measured by dollars or by the same units. So basically in the US, they're measured by US dollars. In Canada, it's Canadian dollars. In Britain, it's British pound. So they're measured by the same units. However, things that do not have a market value are excluded. So if you do housework for yourself, it's not part of GDP. But if you hire somebody to do the housework for you, then it is part of GDP. So for example, if you mow your own lawn, that's not part of GDP, but if you pay somebody to mow your lawn, that is part of GDP. It is the market value of all final goods. So the goods are intended for the end user. They don't include intermediate goods. Intermediate goods are used in the production process. So for example, if we're making a chair, okay, a lot of things goes into the production of a chair, like woods, nail, glue, different kinds of like um, paint and other stuff to make a chair. So instead of valuing each of them, each of those products separately, we just find the market value of the final product, which is the chair. So GDP only includes final goods, and they already have, and the reason is the final goods already have within them embedded the value of the intermediate products that are used in the production of the final product. GDP includes all the tangible products that we have, like food, clothing, DVDs. They also have a lot of the services that we have, that services that we are using every day, but they're not tangible, such as dry cleaning, such as internet service, cell phone service. All those things are intangibles, but they have a price and we pay for them, so they're included in GDP. GDP only includes currently produced goods, but not goods produced in the past. So for example, if you bought a home today that is a brand new home that was built in this current year, then it will be part of this year's GDP. But if you bought a home that was built, let's say 1995 or 1980, that was included in 1980's GDP. So those things are not part of this year's GDP. So if you bought a certified pre-owned car or a used car that this year, that's not part of this year's GDP. That was part of the GDP when it was produced. But if you bought a brand new car, then it's part of this year's GDP. GDP measures the production of the goods and services within the borders of a country, regardless of citizenship status. So anybody who can produce within the US or who is producing any product within the US, all those products are part of US GDP. And it is usually during a given period of time. So usually a quarter, excuse me, or a year. So in short, it's basically all the products that the country produces in a given period of time that are intended for the final user. So what are the component of GDP? So GDP is also total spending. So there are four components of GDP: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. So think about it, GDP as the income of the country. So income is denoted by Y. So if we are thinking about an individual, what do we do with our income? Part of it we consume, part of it we invest we save or we invest so that we have money in the future. Part of it goes to the government as taxes, and part of it we buy stuff from abroad because we like to enjoy some foreign products like French wine or French cheese or Canadian maple syrup or something like that. So just like that, the GDP that we earn in the country, part of it is consumed, part of it is invested so that we can produce more in the future, part of it is used by the government to provide services for us all, and part of it is used to buy products from abroad. So what is consumption? Consumption is total spending by households on goods and services. GNS is goods and services. It can be goods like actual tangible products or intangible products too. Housing costs is a little different. For renters, consumption includes rent payments because we are renting or paying the landlord money to have the right to stay in a place. For homeowners, though, consumption is the imputed rental value. So it's basically that the homeowner is the renter and the landlord. So the amount that they pay as renter to the landlord, it's an imputed value. Technically, it's the same person. But that part is considered to be part of GDP. So basically, the landlord, or if you own a house, you're giving up. You could have rented that house and lived on the streets, but you're not doing that. You're actually staying in the house. So you are giving up that rent. So it's the opportunity cost of living in the house. That is part of consumption component of GDP. However, the purchase price or mortgage payment that we make, they are not part of GDP, current year's GDP. Investment is the total spending on goods that will be used in the future to produce more goods. So spending on capital machinery. So if a company creates a new factory, that's considered investment. Housing purchases are considered to be investment. So if you buy a house, it's technically a house is a people normally buy houses, yes, to stay, but it is also a big investment. That's probably the biggest purchase a person makes in their lifetime. So housing is considered to be an investment. Inventories, goods that are sold or produced but not sold, those are considered part of investment. However, investment does not mean, although we use this word that way, it doesn't mean that when we purchase financial assets like stocks and bonds. If we're purchasing stocks and bonds, although we say we invested in the stock exchange, that's not the correct term. Government purchase is government spending of all levels of government, so federal, state, local, city, county level, all levels of government. However, G does not include transfer payments, which is basically social security payments or disability insurance or unemployment insurance, because those are, once they're not intended for the end user, they're just one-time payment. There's no transaction going on. Not a one-time payment, I meant there's a one-way payment. There's no transaction going on. And the people who get those transfer payments are using them for purchasing other goods and services. So it would be double counting. So instead of that, we're just considering, okay, just transfer payments. Just transfer payments are they will be used for consumption, so it can be part of consumption component of GDP, but they won't be part of the government purchases. So transfer payments are not purchases of goods and services, they are one-way payments, so they're not part of the government spending. Net exports is exports minus imports. NX stands for that. Exports, as we talked about earlier in the Of course, export represents foreign spending of goods and services. So when a British individual purchases a Nike shoe, that's considered to be US export. But when we purchase, let's say, British textbooks from England, that's considered to be an English, that's when we are importing products from England. So when we add all those components up, we get GDP. GDP is C plus I plus G plus NX. How much is it? So currently, the US GDP is about $17 trillion. Out of that, we consume about 70% of GDP. We invest about 16% of GDP. Government is about 20% of GDP. And we spend about $500 billion, or around 3% of GDP, to buy other products. In per capita terms, so about each individual in the US produces about $53,000 worth of goods and services. Out of that $53,000, each individual consumes about $36,000 worth of products, goods and services. So these are on an average. So of course, some people earn much more, some people earn much less, but on an average, an American earns about $53,000. About $9,000 is invested for the future, about $10,000 is paid as taxes, and about $1,500 is used to buy products from abroad. Now, there is a difference between real and nominal GDP. Inflation distorts economic variables like GDP, so we have two versions. One is a nominal GDP, where we value products using current prices, and they're not corrected for inflation. And the other one is real GDP, where we value the amount we're producing every year based on prices of a certain base year, and it is corrected for inflation. So anytime prices go up, and we're going to study it next in the next couple of chapters, prices go up every year, and so we want to make sure that we are actually producing more, and not just the amount that we're producing is being inflated by higher prices. So let's look at an example. So let's say we have an economy that just produces pizza and lattes. So in 2011, we produced 400 pizza at price, and they were sold at $10. In 2012, price rose to $11. In 2013, price rose to $12. Latte is the same thing. Price is $2, $2.50, and $3 for each of those years, and the quantities are listed. Now, if we wanted to find nominal GDP, so in 2011, the total value of pizza was 400 pizza was being produced times 10, which is $10 per pizza. And the price of latte was $2, and 1,000 units of lattes were sold. So in total, you have $6,000 worth of goods and services, final goods and services, being produced in this economy in 1 year. In 2012, it is 11 times 500 plus 250 times 1100. So it's 8,250. In 2013, it is 10,800. So now, in this case, if I'm a policymaker and I'm saying, all right, from 2011 to 2012, prices went up, our GDP went up by 37.5%. However, the problem is, I could have just raised GDP by just raising prices. I'm not sure, did the GDP go up because prices are going up? Or is it because I'm actually producing more? Okay, you could have higher prices and still produce the same amount, and it would show that your GDP is going up. So is that right? So in that case, so what we do then to get around that is we consider, all right, let's think that prices are constant. If we hold prices constant, then what happens to GDP? So let's say that we're holding 2011 as base year. You can hold any year as base year. You could hold 2013 as base year, or 2012 as base year. But for this example, we're using 2011 as base year, which means that we're holding prices to be constant at 2011 prices. So now in 2011, what is my GDP? it is 10 times 400 plus 2 times 1000, which is 6000. So in 2012 now, what is GDP? We're holding 2011 prices, but we're using this, multiplying this by 500. And we're using $2 and multiplying this by 1100. So we're not considering 2012 prices, we're considering 2011 prices. Same thing with 2013, we're not holding 2013 prices, but we're using 2011 prices to calculate GDP. Now in this case, we can see, look, the prices are held constant. So the only reason why these numbers are going up is because we're actually producing more. So the quantity that we're producing of both pizza or latte is actually going up. Now if I say that, if I measure the percentage change, which is 20%, now I can say that, all right, now I know that I'm producing 20% more goods and services in this economy between 2011 and 12. Between 2012 and 13, I'm producing 16.7% more goods and services. Since we held prices constant, we can now say that that increase is mainly because we're producing more. So in each year, GDP is, so this is just, we got it from that number, from the previous exercise. Nominal GDP is measured using current prices. Real GDP is measured using constant prices from a base year, and in our example, it is 2011. The change in nominal GDP reflects both prices and quantities. However, the change in real GDP it's only measuring the increases in quantity. So we're holding prices as constant. So of course, changes in real GDP will be lower than changes in nominal GDP for the most part. But we do see that, okay, now if I look at real GDP increasing, I can say that yes, we're producing more goods. So real GDP is corrected for inflation or rise in prices. This is how nominal and real GDP looks like. So over time, US economy has been doing well. This period from 1990 till 2000, this has been the longest period of economic expansion the US has ever seen. The US was not doing so well here. This is the early 1980s, and this is the Great Recession that we saw. Now, GDP deflator is an overall measure of prices. One way of measuring how prices change from one year to the next is using GDP deflator. The definition is this: nominal GDP over real GDP times 100 is GDP deflator. Students always make the mistake, they put real on top, nominal on the bottom, but it's always nominal GDP on top. So one way to measure inflation is to measure the percentage change of GDP deflator from one year to the next. So in this case, for the base year, GDP deflator is always going to be 100. For 2012, it is 8,250 divided by 7,200, which is times 100, which comes out to be 114. For 2013, it is 10,800 divided by 8,400 times 100. Now, if I want to calculate inflation rate, I just calculate the percentage change of GDP deflator from one year to the next. So for this year, this would be 128.6 minus 114.6 divided by 114.6 times 100. And that should give you 12.2%. Now, how important is GDP? Real GDP per capita is what we use to understand or to measure the average person's standard of living in a country. So when we say a country is a rich country, we mean that the GDP per person or GDP per capita is high or low. So the richest country in the world, we say, is either Qatar or Luxembourg. On an average, each person there earns about $100,000. In America, it's about $55,000. Some of the poorest countries in the world are, one is Congo, where an average person earns about $300 per year. So by that, using GDP per capita, we measure how rich or poor a country is. However, GDP is not the perfect measure of well-being. Senator Robert Kennedy, he actually was a very harsh critic of the GDP, and he had a very eloquent statement why GDP is not good. So he says that GDP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of our education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, the strength of our marriages, and the intelligence of our public debates, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our courage nor our wisdom or devotion. It measures everything, in short, that which makes life worthwhile, and it can tell us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans. So what does that mean? Well, GDP does not value the quality of the environment. So you could have a high income but live in a very polluted neighborhood, and GDP will still think that you're a wealthy person. It does not measure leisure time. Some countries might have, like in France, their work week is much lower. It's 30 to 35 hours per week, but their GDP per capita is pretty similar to other countries where some countries like Germany or England where they work much longer. So how do you measure that? Well, the French people have more leisure time, so they should have, but that is not part included into GDP because we don't value leisure using dollar amounts. Non-market activities such as childcare is not part of GDP. So if a parent reads a book to the child, that's not part of GDP. But if a parent hires somebody to read to the child, that would be part of GDP. Or an equitable distribution of income. How is income distributed in the society? GDP does not value that. A person can have all the money and the rest of the people may have no money, and you would still have a pretty high GDP. So this is all we have from chapter 23. It's a very short chapter. It basically just introduces how do we measure GDP. And so in the next chapters, we're going to learn some more about macroeconomics. Okay, well, have a good rest of the day.